Welcome to this episode of Great Cities and Institutions. Today, we are going to look at the Knights Templar, an order of warrior monks who invented international banking, became the wealthiest institution in Europe outside the church, and were destroyed in a single morning by a king who owed them money. Every week on this channel, we step inside the great cities, empires, and institutions that shaped the world we still live in today, tracing not just when they rose, but why and what it actually cost to build something meant to last forever. Today's story is the most mythologized institution in European history, and I want to say something at the outset about that. You have almost certainly encountered the Templars through the conspiracy version. The Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, secret treasure buried on an island off Nova Scotia, hidden survival through the centuries, and a secret bloodline. That version has sold an extraordinary number of books. The actual history is better. It contains a genuinely revolutionary financial invention, a military order that answered to nobody but the Pope, a bankrupt king with a plan, a document rediscovered in the Vatican archives in 2001 that overturned 7 centuries of assumption, and an ending in which the order's symbol was carried quite literally across the Atlantic on the sails of ships. By the end of this episode, you will know how 9 knights became a multinational corporation, how they accidentally invented something close to the check, why Friday the 13th has almost certainly nothing to do with them, what the Chinon parchment revealed, and what actually happened to the order, which is a great deal less mysterious and a great deal more interesting than the legend. Let's begin in Jerusalem, in the year 1119. The First Crusade had ended 20 years earlier with the capture of the city, and a set of Christian states had been established along the eastern Mediterranean coast: the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the County of Tripoli, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa. Collectively, they are known as the Crusader states, or Outremer, meaning across the sea. They had a problem that was practical rather than theological. They were chronically short of manpower. Most crusaders had gone home. Having fulfilled their vow, they returned to their estates in Europe, and the territory left behind was held by a thin population of settlers surrounded by considerably larger neighboring powers. And a specific danger followed from that. Pilgrims arriving by sea at Jaffa had to travel inland to Jerusalem, and the road was not secure. Contemporary accounts describe bandits attacking pilgrim parties, and one report describes hundreds killed on the road in a single incident. So a French knight, named Hugues de Payens, together with a small group of companions, approached King Baldwin II of Jerusalem with a proposal. They would take monastic vows, poverty, chastity, and obedience, and they would devote themselves to protecting pilgrims on the roads. Traditional accounts give the founding number as 9, though that figure comes from later sources, and modern historians treat it with some caution. Baldwin granted them quarters in a wing of the royal palace, which occupied the Al-Aqsa Mosque on the Temple Mount. Crusaders believed the site to be the Temple of Solomon, and that is where the name comes from. The order's full title was the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, and of the Temple of Solomon. Poor Knights of the Temple, Templars. Now, the theological problem, because it is genuinely interesting and it had to be solved before any of this could work. A monk takes vows. A monk does not kill people. Killing was a sin requiring penance, and the church had spent centuries trying to restrain the violence of the knightly class rather than sanctify it. So what exactly is a warrior monk? The man who answered that question was one of the most influential figures of the 12th century, Bernard of Clairvaux, the Cistercian abbot, later canonized, and a relative of one of the founding knights. Bernard wrote a treatise, generally known as in praise of the new knighthood which set out the argument. He distinguished between ordinary knights, whose violence he regarded as vain and sinful, and this new kind of knight, fighting not for glory or plunder, but as an instrument of divine purpose. He argued that killing an enemy of Christ in that cause was not homicide, but, in a phrase that has troubled readers ever since, the killing of evil. Whatever one thinks of that reasoning, and I would not defend it, it was decisive. It gave the order legitimacy. In 1129, at the Council of Troyes, the order was formally endorsed and given a rule, largely drawn from Cistercian practice and shaped substantially by Bernard's influence. It governed everything: prayer, meals, clothing, discipline, and conduct in battle. Then came the document that changed everything. In 1139, Pope Innocent II issued a papal bull, Omni Datum Optimum, and its provisions are the institutional key to the entire story. The Templars were made answerable to the Pope alone. No king, no bishop, no local authority had jurisdiction over them. They were exempted from paying tithes and permitted to collect them. They could pass freely across all borders. They could keep spoils taken in battle. They were permitted their own chaplains, meaning they did not depend on the local church hierarchy. Consider what that creates: an organization operating across every kingdom in Christendom, exempt from taxation in all of them, subject to no local law, with its own clergy, its own finances, and a single, distant authority to whom it answers. That is not a monastery. It is a supranational corporation with diplomatic immunity, and it is the reason both for the order's extraordinary success and ultimately for its destruction. Now, the innovation that actually mattered, and it had nothing to do with fighting. Consider the pilgrim's problem. You are a moderately wealthy person in England or France. You wish to travel to Jerusalem, a journey of many months. You need funds for the entire journey and to fund your return. Carrying that money means carrying gold through multiple kingdoms, across regions with limited law enforcement, in a party visibly identifiable as pilgrims, meaning visibly identifiable as people carrying money. The Templars offered a solution. Deposit your funds at a Templar house in London or Paris. Receive a document. Travel with nothing of value. Present the document at a Templar house in Jerusalem and withdraw the equivalent. Historians debate exactly how the system was administered, and the surviving evidence is thinner than one would like. But the essential function is not in doubt, and it is remarkable: a network of branches across multiple countries, honoring credit issued elsewhere, allowing value to be moved without moving the physical money. That is, in effect, an early letter of credit, and something close to the traveler's check, operating in the 12th century. The reason they could do it, and nobody else could, is precisely the papal privileges we just described. Cross-border operation requires an organization that exists across borders and is not subject to local seizure. The Templars were uniquely that organization, and it grew far beyond pilgrims. The Paris Temple became, in practical terms, the treasury of France. The French crown kept its money there and used Templar officials to administer royal finances. In England, the new temple in London performed a comparable role, and the crown jewels were at one point stored there. They made loans. They collected taxes on behalf of rulers. They held funds in trust and acted as executors. They arranged payment of ransoms, which was a significant business in an age when captured nobles were routinely ransomed. There is a question that hangs over all this, which is usury. Christian doctrine prohibited lending money at interest, and the Templars were a religious order. The historical answer is that the prohibition was navigated rather than observed. Charges were structured as fees, as rent on pledged property, as differences in exchange rate, or as compensation for costs. The effect was interest under another name, and the practice was widespread throughout medieval finance rather than peculiar to the Templars. Beyond banking, they became an economic power in their own right. They accumulated estates across Europe, thousands of properties, running farms, mills, vineyards, quarries, and markets. They operated a substantial fleet, both for transporting men and supplies to the east and for commercial shipping. La Rochelle, on the French Atlantic coast, was a significant Templar port. They built. Templar churches were frequently round, echoing the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem and the Temple Church in London, consecrated in the 1180s, still stands with its round nave and the effigies of knights on its floor. In the Holy Land, they held major fortifications, and the castle at Tortosa and the sea fortress at Atlit are among those associated with them. At their height, estimates of total membership generally run to somewhere in the region of 15 to 20,000, of whom only a small minority, perhaps a tenth, were the knights themselves. The remainder were sergeants, chaplains, and a large body of workers and administrators managing the estates that generated the wealth. It is worth pausing on what life inside the order actually involved, because the popular image is entirely military and the reality was mostly monastic. A Templar's day was structured by prayer. The rule required attendance at the canonical hours, beginning before dawn and continuing through the day. And where military duty made attendance impossible, a fixed number of recitations was required instead. They ate in silence, listening to readings, and the rule specifies meat only on certain days of the week and communal eating in pairs from a shared dish, so that each could observe whether the other was eating adequately. Their appearance was regulated. Knights wore the white mantle, signifying purity, with the red cross added by papal grant in the 1140s. Sergeants wore black or brown. Beards were required and hair kept short, which in an era of elaborate courtly fashion marked them out immediately. Personal possessions were forbidden. Everything belonged to the order, and one of the more serious offenses in the rule was to be found holding property privately. The knight who arrived with an estate surrendered it on entry. The rule forbade hunting for pleasure, with the notable exception of lions, presumably on practical grounds. Contact with women was severely restricted, including with female relatives, and the rule contains a striking prohibition on kissing any woman, mother, and sister included. Discipline was harsh and precisely graded. Penances ran from reduced food, to eating from the floor, to being stripped of the habit for a period, to permanent expulsion. Losing the habit was the most feared punishment short of expulsion, and offenses that carried it included striking a fellow Christian, revealing the order's chapter proceedings, and desertion. And this last point matters for what follows. Chapter meetings, including the initiation ceremony, were held in absolute secrecy, at night, behind closed doors, with disclosure punishable by expulsion. That secrecy was disciplinary rather than sinister. It also meant that when the order was accused of appalling things happening behind those doors, it had no easy way to demonstrate otherwise, and outsiders had no basis on which to disbelieve the charge. Now the fighting, because that reputation was earned. The Templar Knight was heavy cavalry, and heavy cavalry in this period was the decisive arm of European warfare. A charge by armored knights on armored horses, delivered in close formation, was capable of breaking a line outright. What distinguished the Templars was discipline. Their rule imposed a code of conduct in battle that ordinary feudal armies could not match. They did not charge without an order. They did not break formation to pursue a fleeing enemy, which was the standard failure of medieval cavalry and had lost many battles. and they were forbidden to retreat unless ordered, or unless the odds against them exceeded 3-1, and even then they were required to withdraw toward the banner rather than scatter. That banner was the beau séant, divided black and white, and the rule held that as long as it flew, no Templar could leave the field. They also, notably, could not be ransomed. Where a captured noble knight would be held for a payment, the Templar rule forbade ransom, offering only a belt and a knife, which produced a genuine and grim consequence. Captured Templars were frequently executed because there was no financial reason to keep them and because they were regarded as the most committed of enemies. Chroniclers record that after the Battle of Hattin in 1187, Saladin ordered the execution of the captured Templars and Hospitallers while sparing and ransoming other prisoners. Their most celebrated action came at Montgisard in 1177, where a small Christian force, including a contingent of Templars, attacked a much larger army under Saladin and inflicted a serious defeat. But the decisive engagement went the other way. At Hattin, in 1187, the Crusader army was maneuvered into waterless ground, surrounded and destroyed. Jerusalem fell within months. The Crusader states never recovered their position, and although the Third Crusade regained part of the coast, the kingdom that survived was a diminished thing centered on Acre. One piece of context is essential before we reach the ending, because the Templars were not alone, and their fate is only comprehensible by comparison. There were other military orders, founded on the same model and operating alongside them. The Knights Hospitaller had begun earlier, as a hospital in Jerusalem caring for sick pilgrims, and militarized subsequently. They wore black with a white cross. Crucially, they retained a charitable and medical function throughout, which the Templars never developed to the same degree. The Teutonic Knights emerged from a German field hospital during the Siege of Acre and turned their attention northward, conquering and governing territory along the Baltic. They eventually built a state of their own, with its capital at the enormous brick fortress of Malbork. Those two orders matter for one reason above all. They survived. The Hospitallers, evicted from the Holy Land alongside everyone else, took Rhodes, held it for 2 centuries, were expelled by the Ottomans, were granted Malta, and withstood the Great Siege of 1565. The order exists to this day as a sovereign entity and a humanitarian organization. The Teutonic Knights lost their Baltic state over time, but the order also survives, now in a charitable form. So the question is not why military orders were destroyed after the Crusader states fell, because 2 of the 3 were not. It is why this one was, and the answers separate them cleanly. The Hospitallers had a second purpose beyond fighting, and could point to hospitals when the wars ended. The Teutonic Knights had relocated to a frontier where the fighting continued, and had built a territorial state of their own. The Templars had neither. They had no charitable function to fall back on, no territory of their own to withdraw into, and their wealth was concentrated in properties across kingdoms whose rulers could reach them. They were the richest, the most exposed, and the only one of the 3 with no remaining reason to exist, which brings us to the event that doomed the order, and it was not the trial. In 1291, Acre fell to the Mamluk Sultanate after a siege of several weeks. It was the last major Crusader stronghold on the mainland. The Templar quarter held out to the end, and the Grand Master was killed in the fighting. With that, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land effectively ended. The Templars withdrew to Cyprus, and now consider their position, because this is the strategic heart of the whole story. The Knights Templar were founded to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem and later to defend the Crusader states. Jerusalem was gone. The Crusader states were gone. The pilgrim routes they had been created to guard no longer existed under Christian control. They remained enormously wealthy, entirely tax-exempt, immune from royal jurisdiction, holding property in every kingdom in Europe, maintaining a private army, and answerable to nobody except a pope. They had lost their purpose and kept every one of their privileges. That is a dangerous position for any institution, and it was made considerably more dangerous by public mood. There was criticism of the military orders after the loss of the Holy Land, questions about what the donations of Europe had achieved, and proposals circulating that the Templars and the Hospitallers should be merged, which the Templars resisted. Meanwhile, in France, there was a king with a problem. Philip IV, called Philip the Fair, ruled France from 1285 to 1314, and his central difficulty throughout was money. He had fought expensive wars against England and in Flanders. The Flemish campaign had gone badly, including a serious defeat at Courtrai in 1302, where French knights were destroyed by a militia force, and his responses to financial pressure had a consistent pattern. He debased the coinage repeatedly, which produced inflation and unrest. He taxed the French clergy, which brought him into a ferocious confrontation with Pope Boniface VIII, culminating in French agents seizing the elderly pope at Anagni in 1303. Boniface was released and died shortly afterwards. In 1306, he expelled the Jewish population of France and seized their assets, including debts owed to them, which were then payable to the crown. He moved against Lombard bankers similarly, and he had borrowed heavily from the Templars. During a riot in Paris caused by his currency manipulation, he had taken refuge in the Paris Temple, which meant he had personally seen the treasury. Then, in 1305, a Frenchman was elected pope, taking the name Clement V, and the papacy relocated to Avignon, in territory subject to French influence. That is the beginning of the period we discussed in the Vatican episode as the Avignon papacy. So the pieces are assembled. A king who needs money, who has form for seizing the assets of unpopular groups, with a compliant pope facing an order that is rich, no longer obviously necessary, and protected only by papal authority. What was needed was a pretext, and accusations were duly gathered, reportedly from expelled or disgruntled former members. Now, the 13th of October, 1307. Sealed orders had been sent to royal officials across France, with instructions that they were not to be opened until the appointed dawn. The orders were executed simultaneously. Templars across the kingdom were arrested in a coordinated operation on a single morning, including the Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, who had been in Paris and who, the previous day, had been a pallbearer at a royal funeral. The scale of the arrests is sometimes exaggerated. Modern estimates suggest several hundred to somewhat over 1,000 arrested in France, rather than the many thousands sometimes claimed. The charges were designed to be unanswerable and unforgivable. That initiates were required to deny Christ and spit on the cross, that they exchanged obscene kisses during initiation, that they worshipped an idol, described variously and referred to in some confessions as Baphomet, that they engaged in homosexual acts, that they were required to keep the initiation ceremony absolutely secret. That last point is significant because the initiation was in fact secret, which made the accusations difficult to disprove. And then the confessions came, in quantity, including from the Grand Master himself. They came because of torture. The methods used are documented. The strappado, in which the victim is suspended by the arms tied behind the back and dropped. The application of fire to the feet, and one Templar reportedly brought the bones of his own feet, which had fallen out, to a subsequent hearing. Starvation and prolonged confinement. The historical consensus is straightforward. These were confessions extracted under torture, in a legal environment where confession was regarded as the strongest form of proof and where the accused frequently did not know what would satisfy the interrogator until they were told. And there is a decisive piece of evidence for that. Outside France, where the same accusations were investigated, but torture was initially not applied, or applied far less, the confessions largely did not appear. In England, in Scotland, in Ireland, in Aragon, in Cyprus, and in Germany, investigations produced little. It was only where French pressure was applied and torture permitted that the pattern of confession reappeared. Pope Clement, presented with a fait accompli, initially objected to Philip's action as an infringement of papal jurisdiction. He then sought to take control of the process, ordering arrests throughout Christendom and establishing papal commissions, which produced, in 1308, the document that changed our understanding of this entire episode 7 centuries later. Clement sent representatives to Chinon, where the senior leadership was held, to examine them personally. For most of history, the record of that hearing was unknown, and it was assumed that Clement had simply acquiesced in the destruction of the order. Then, in 2001, a researcher in the Vatican Secret Archives named Barbara Frailer identified a parchment which had been misfiled, catalogued incorrectly, and effectively lost for centuries. The Chinon parchment records that the papal representatives heard the leaders, that the leaders admitted certain irregularities in the initiation ritual while denying the graver charges, that they sought absolution, and that the papal representatives granted it. The Pope's own commission absolved the Templar leadership. That is an extraordinary finding. It does not establish that nothing improper ever occurred in Templar initiations, and Frail herself has argued that some ritual involving symbolic denial may have existed, perhaps as a test of obedience or a preparation for the possibility of capture. Other historians dispute that interpretation. What it does establish is that the Church, having examined them directly, did not find them guilty of heresy, which makes what followed considerably worse. In 1310, the Archbishop of Sens, an appointee of the French crown, took a group of Templars who had retracted their confessions before the papal commission. 54 of them were burned at Paris in a single day. The effect on the remaining defense was exactly as intended. Retracting a confession had been demonstrated to be fatal. In 1312, at the Council of Vienne, Clement issued the bull Vox in excelso. The wording of it matters, and it is frequently misreported. The council was not persuaded that the charges were proven, and the bull does not condemn the order as heretical. It states, in effect, that the order's reputation had been so damaged and the scandal so great that it could no longer function usefully, and it suppressed the order by administrative decision rather than by judicial condemnation. The Templars were not found guilty. They were abolished as no longer viable. A second bull, ad providam, transferred their property to the Knights Hospitaller, their long-standing rivals, though not, in practice, all of it. The French crown deducted very substantial sums for the costs of the trials and for the administration of the properties during their seizure, and considerable value never reached the Hospitallers at all. In some kingdoms, particularly in Iberia, the property went elsewhere entirely. And then the ending. Jacques de Molay had been imprisoned for nearly 7 years. In March 1314, he and Geoffroy de Charnay, the preceptor of Normandy, were brought before a platform in Paris to make a public confirmation of their confessions and receive sentences of perpetual imprisonment. Instead, in front of the assembled crowd, de Molay repudiated his confession. He declared the order innocent and stated that his earlier admission had been false and obtained by fear of torture. He was therefore, by the legal logic of the day, a relapsed heretic, and Philip ordered his immediate execution. That evening, the 18th of March, 1314, he and de Charnay were burned on an island in the Seine. Chroniclers record that de Molay asked to be positioned so that he could see the towers of Notre Dame, and that he died without crying out. And here is where legend takes over, so let me mark it clearly. The story goes that from the flames de Molay summoned both Pope Clement and King Philip to meet him before God's tribunal within the year. Clement died in April 1314, roughly a month later. Philip died in November of the same year, following a hunting accident or a stroke depending on the account. He was 46. Both deaths are historical fact. The curse is not. It appears in later sources rather than in contemporary accounts of the execution, and it has the unmistakable shape of a story constructed after the outcome was known. But the coincidence is genuine, and it is one of the reasons this episode has never lost its grip on the imagination. Now let me deal with the myths, because they have almost entirely displaced the history. First, Friday the 13th. You will read constantly that the superstition originates with the arrests of Friday the 13th of October, 1307. There is no evidence for this. The claim appears to be modern, popularized in the 20th century, and enormously amplified by a best-selling novel in 2003. Fear of the number 13 and unease about Fridays both have long and separate histories in European culture. But the specific combination as an unlucky day does not appear in the record until the 19th century, roughly 500 years after the arrests. If the Templar connection were the origin, the superstition should appear immediately afterwards. It does not. Second, the Holy Grail and the Ark of the Covenant. The claim is that the Templars, quartered on the Temple Mount, excavated beneath it and recovered sacred relics, which they then concealed. There is no medieval evidence for this. The association of the Templars with the Grail begins in literature, notably in a 13th century German romance in which an order of knights guards the Grail, and literary invention has been read backwards as historical claim ever since. Third, the treasure fleet from La Rochelle. The story holds that, warned of the arrests, the Templars loaded their treasure onto a fleet at La Rochelle, which sailed away and vanished, variously to Scotland, to Portugal, or across the Atlantic. The evidence for this rests on a single ambiguous statement in the trial records about ships and nothing more. There is no record of such a fleet arriving anywhere. Fourth, the Freemasons. The claim of descent from the Templars is the most widespread of all, and there is no documented connection. Freemasonry emerges in the historical record in Britain in the 17th and early 18th centuries, roughly 400 years after the suppression. The Templar-themed degrees within Masonic systems are 18th century creations, developed in a period of considerable enthusiasm for romantic and chivalric origin stories. They are inventions of that era, not inheritances. Fifth, Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland. Built in the 15th century, more than 100 years after the suppression, by a family with no documented Templar connection. Its carvings are elaborate and much reinterpreted, and the claims made about them are modern. Sixth, Oak Island in Nova Scotia, where the treasure has been sought for over 2 centuries without any Templar artifact being produced. And seventh, Baphomet. The name appears in the trial confessions, and its origin is disputed, with one plausible suggestion being a corruption of Mahomet, reflecting a standard medieval slander of associating enemies with Islam. The familiar goat-headed image has nothing to do with the Templars at all. It was drawn by a French occultist, Eliphas Lévy, in the 19th century, and subsequently attached to the Templars retrospectively. Now, the part that is true and that almost nobody knows, and it is a far better ending than the treasure fleet. The suppression was not uniform across Europe because the political situation differed by kingdom. The Templar properties in Portugal passed to it. Templar members joined it. The headquarters was at Tomar, a Templar castle, which the new order continued to hold and to build. It was, in substance, the same institution, under a different name and a royal rather than papal allegiance. And now, the payoff. In the 15th century, the Grand Master of the Order of Christ was Prince Henry of Portugal, known as Henry the Navigator, who directed the Portuguese exploration of the African coast, and who used the order's revenues to fund it. The Order of Christ financed the voyages that opened the sea route around Africa, and the Portuguese caravels carried a red cross on their sails. It was the cross of the Order of Christ, derived from the Templar cross. So when Vasco da Gama reached India in 1498, the event we identified in the Venice episode as the beginning of that republic's long decline, the ships that did it sailed under a version of the Templar cross, funded by the direct institutional successor of the Templars in Portugal. That symbol crossed the Atlantic. It appears on the sails in Portuguese depictions of the voyages to Brazil, and versions of the cross remain in Portuguese heraldry and insignia today. In Spain, similarly, Templar properties in Valencia went to a new order, the Order of Montesa. In Aragon, the process was negotiated rather than violent. In England and Scotland, most Templars were pensioned into other houses rather than executed. In Germany, most simply joined other orders. Outside France, in other words, there was no bloodbath. There were transfers, negotiations, and pensions, which tells you what the whole affair actually was. So let me draw it together. The Knights Templar were not destroyed because of what they believed. The Pope's own commission absolved their leaders, and we know that now because a parchment was found misfiled in the Vatican archives 700 years later. They were not destroyed because they had done anything unusual. The accusations were extracted under torture, and where torture was not applied, the accusations largely evaporated. They were destroyed because of an alignment of circumstances that had nothing to do with heresy. They were extremely rich. They were exempt from taxation in every kingdom where they held property. They were immune from royal jurisdiction. They maintained an armed force answerable to nobody local. They had lost the purpose that had justified all of those privileges when the Holy Land fell, and they had lent a great deal of money to a king who could not repay it and who had already demonstrated twice what he was prepared to do to creditors and to unpopular minorities. An institution in that position is not protected by its innocence, because innocence was never the question. And that is the argument I would leave you with, because it generalizes well beyond the 14th century. The Templars' fatal error was not a secret ritual. It was outliving their function while retaining their privileges, in the presence of someone with the power to notice and the motive to act. Institutions that no longer do the thing that justified their existence, but continue to hold the wealth and the exemptions granted for it, are not usually reformed. They are dismantled by whoever needs what they hold. As for the treasure, there is no evidence it went anywhere. It was seized, litigated over, deducted from, and absorbed in the entirely mundane way that assets are. The genuine inheritance is not buried on an island. It was carried out of Lisbon Harbor, painted on a sail, on ships heading for India. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel for more stories of the great cities, empires, and institutions that built the world we live in. Leave a comment below, telling us which castle, city, or institution you would like us to explore next.